It's the Middle East. Things can change on a dime. One day you're my enemy, the next day we're toasting each other with a peace agreement. It's happened before.
Now, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has told Israel and Hamas that the time is now for a deal to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza and free the remaining hostages held there. Antony Blinken, who is in the region, said a deal was on the table and Hamas should agree to it. He was speaking in Israel earlier today.
Let's see if we can get this done. Look, I think this is something that the whole world is watching, and if Hamas actually purports to care about the Palestinian people and wants to see an immediate alleviation of their suffering, it will take the deal. If it doesn't, I think that's further proof that it doesn't care a bit about the Palestinian people.
Well, mediators are said to be awaiting a response from Hamas to the latest proposal, which is said to include a 40-day ceasefire and the release of more than 30 Israeli hostages in exchange for many more Palestinian prisoners. Let's talk to Joel Rubin, who's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Good evening to you, Joel.
Hey, Carol. Good to talk to you.
Really good to have you with us. Antony Blinken back in Israel, putting pressure seemingly on Hamas. Is there any sense that we are actually getting anywhere closer to actually reaching an agreement for another ceasefire?
Well, we're closer today than a couple weeks ago, but we're not there yet. And absolutely, Secretary Blinken is twisting as many arms as he can in the Gulf because this potential deal of a ceasefire for hostage exchange, is central to the administration's strategy going forward to try to unlock Gulf Arab states' support for humanitarian assistance, to move on a path towards some type of diplomatic process with the Palestinians and the Israelis on a day after governance questions, and you name it, just reducing regional tensions overall. So this is the core blockage. But the problem, there's a paradox here, Carol. I got to say it, and I'm not saying anything original here. It's that the Hamas leadership does not want to let hostages go without ensuring that they will not be killed the day after. And that is what's holding it up. They're really worried about how Israel will continue to hunt them down. And so they want to hold on to those hostages to prevent that.
Yeah, and I mean, Israel has made it clear it does still intend to try to hunt down the remaining Hamas fighters. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, only yesterday, saying that Israel's going to go ahead with a military operation into Rafah, regardless of the delicate stage of these talks.
Yeah, and you have to ask: is this posturing or is it real? And um, this is the Middle East. Things can change on a dime. One day you're my enemy, the next day we're toasting each other with a peace agreement. It's happened before. So while I understand the logic and the concern about a Rafah invasion being talked about, therefore Hamas can't do anything, that's not a preordained outcome. It's quite possible that if Hamas were to agree to release the hostages, the political climate in Israel would change, and we could see more leverage and pressure on the parties to not continue the fight in different ways out of this conundrum. So nothing is written in stone. But what we do know is that the current status quo will lead to a Rafah invasion by Israel, and it will lead to more suffering for the Palestinian people.
Yeah, because of course there have been very grave concerns expressed by the US and by the UK as well about what would happen if there was a big military offensive there. Well over 1 million Palestinians who fled from other parts of Gaza still in Rafah. I mean, is it clear whether Israel has a plan to actually move civilians out of the way?
Carol, everything you said is right. It could be devastating, a military ground campaign on Rafah. Israel, the IDF is not, Israel Defense Force have not yet provided the kinds of plans that the White House says publicly they're confident in related to protecting civilians. And I got to tell you, I visited Rafah years ago when I served at the State Department as a junior officer. I held the position of the Egypt desk, and I went out to Rafah on the Egyptian side in the Sinai Desert. It's a city divided in two with the border, half in the Sinai, which is Egypt, half in Gaza. uh, the potential for this blowing up the border, harming civilians, creating more chaos is high. And that's why the president's team is asking for a real plan. But getting a real plan on that is extraordinarily complicated and difficult. That said, it's plans. Difficult plans are a lot better than difficult military operations, which are horrifying to unwind. As of yet, you have not seen the president or his team give any blessing to a Rafah invasion, knowing full well though that Netanyahu is getting pressure to do that from his coalition.
Of course, the focus at the moment is very much on keeping up the pressure to try to get that ceasefire agreed. US doing what it can, but essentially only having much influence on one side in all of this. Very little
Right.
influence, of course, over Hamas. But how do you think those protests, which we've just been reporting
Mm-hmm.
on, that have swept across universities in the United States, are affecting the Biden administration? Because they do seem to have taken on a life of their own. Starting in New York, we're now seeing them in a range of different universities in Texas, in Wisconsin, and elsewhere. And a real growing indication of how, for at least some presumably mainly Democrat voters, this is a really
Right.
important issue.
You put your finger on the core issue here, which is that this is a Democratic problem. The Republicans are having a great time watching the president struggle with the base of his party on this issue, where he is trying to be a national security leader and not pay attention to the politics. But uh, elected officials are politicians, and they must pay attention to the politics to keep their jobs. We're not at that acute moment yet in the political cycle. There's still months to go. But the protests have had a major impact on the political narrative. I don't think it's had an impact on the president's decision making. No. And the White House wants to stay as far clear as they can from these protests. They will not send in the National Guard. That is not what they want. They want to stay clear and let the states and local governments handle it. Universities in particular to handle it. I think that's what they're hoping for. But all of this is tied up with the international situation that we're talking about. The intersection of what happens on the ground in Gaza and what happens on the ground in the United States is severe. And if there is a ground invasion of Rafah, it will spike. But if not, and if there's a temporary ceasefire, you could see this also dissipate. Also, one last thing: school's out next week, so a lot of the students may not be around anyways. But that's they'll come back in the fall. They hopefully.
And it is a reminder, though, isn't it, of one of the difficulties that Joe Biden is facing. Normally, he would be hoping to pick up a lot of support amongst younger voters. There are already polls suggesting he's struggling to get that. And in some of those key battleground states,
Yes.
there are large numbers of Arab voters who are really concerned about his handling of this.
There's a real balancing question about who will vote and who will not vote. Amongst young voters, Gen Z voters, two-thirds disapprove of the president's handling of the situation, but nearly 70% say they'll still vote for him anyways. Then you go to the Arab American vote, like in Michigan, where 100,000 voted uncommitted in the Democratic primary. That could flip Michigan to the Republican column if they stay home. But then in reverse, if the president starts pushing so hard on Israel that it backfires or allows the protests to go forward, or doesn't condemn them in any way or show support for the Jewish community, that also has an impact on middle America, which is very uncomfortable with this kind of anti Semitic language that is happening on campus and with these protests. So there's a real balancing. I think the youth vote question, though, is one that the president's team is very focused on issues that matter to young people, like erasing college debt, dealing with climate, the abortion issue, and leaning into that and trying to run as far away from Israel-Gaza, politically speaking, as they can.
Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State under the Obama administration. Really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Carol.
Now, do stay with us here on Times Radio. Good to get your views coming in as well. Colin in Coventry says Israel has put up 40,000 tents outside Rafah as a plan. 5 family members per tent equals 200,000 from 1.2 million. That's the total number of refugees there. This is for show, and any humanitarian can see right through.